Hello, welcome.
Hello, thank you.
Croeso. In terms of legislation. Yeah, no, it's fine. I was reading about legislation.
Far away on.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the S4C's remit in terms of legislation. And it's set out in primary legislation at the moment, and you've accepted that this needs to be amended. Can you tell me when you expect these changes to be brought about?
Well, there are a number of areas where legislative change is likely to be required. In some cases, that's primary. I can't really give you a very clear answer to that question, for which my apologies, because we have pressures on parliamentary time, in part due to Brexit, for the next 18 months, and there has to be some agreement following that between the government's business managers and the opposition as to what then comes before Parliament. So I'm sorry not to be able to give you a clear answer to that question.
But this has been quite a long time in coming, though. I mean, it can hardly be a surprise that this was in the review and that you've accepted that, which is good. But this, as it has been a long time in coming, surely it's not going to be a large piece of legislation. This is something that can be put in.
Well, you rightly point out that it wouldn't be a big piece of legislation, and that therefore gives us ground to hope that the elements of the change that really require legislation we will find time for as a priority, in part because it's important. It's hopefully not likely to be too controversial. It is, as you say, relatively small as government legislation goes, and therefore I'd be quite optimistic about time being found for it as soon as possible. But let's not forget that there's an awful lot in the report and the review that doesn't require legislation, that S4C can be getting on with. So in your words, what would be involved in that piece of legislation, that small piece of legislation?
Can I just add something as well?
Yeah.
Because, I mean, obviously, we've gone through the government response to this, and just to build on my colleague's point here, this is not controversial. My colleague from a different party seems to accept it. I do. The government certainly have. And may I just say, I know you're not the business minister, but I'd have thought the business ministers would be delighted to have a piece of legislation. Isn't it require people to be called back from Strasbourg at short notice or dragged back from anywhere else? I mean, this is surely something that's begging to be put in on a Thursday so that we can all. It is.
I quite agree with you,
David. So.
Yeah. So I know it's probably this isn't a fair.
I do quite agree with you. Thank you.
But nonetheless, maybe through you pass back this thought. That this is a wonderful opportunity for the government to pass some legislation without any rancor here.
Right, okay, well, to come back to your question, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, the main legislative hurdles, if I can call them that, will be recommendations 1, 5, 6 and 7, and they will require a combination of primary and secondary legislation. So I trust that answers your question. We're still exploring legal options, so we're not really in a position to give much more information on implementation at this stage in respect to those areas that do require legislation. And we are discussing the implications with S4C.
Have you had legal advice from your own department on it?
We're in the process of obtaining legal advice, and we're exploring the options. And I'm sorry that this inquiry has fallen at a point before which we're able to come back with anything clearly definitive on that score.
The inquiry was, this review was published last December, if I remember rightly. So that's, 7 months ago. So you haven't, in all that time, not one person within your department has come to you with those proposals?
the pattern of my involvement in this important issue arose probably for the first time in February, when across my desk came the issue of the funding from my department to top up the licence fee funding that S4C enjoys. And at that point there was some debate as to whether or not the funding would be forthcoming. I engaged with the issue, I looked at the review, and I decided that very much the case it should be forthcoming. And I then focused my efforts and energies on making sure the funding was forthcoming, rather than look in detail at the legislative options at that point.
Okay. May I?
Well.
Oh, did you want a quick?
Well, I was just going to follow up with that. So what's your understanding of, what was your understanding of S4C prior to that? Because I know you've come into the role this year.
In January, yes.
What was your understanding of S4C before that?
I had very little awareness of S4C when I assumed the role that I currently occupy. I'm very conscious of the Welsh language and the importance of the Welsh language, and I knew there was Welsh language programming, but I wouldn't have known in any detail about the channel that put it out, or not speaking Welsh myself, I hadn't availed myself of the opportunity of watching the output. I'm not, sadly, really, I'm sure in common with many other members, I'm not a big television consumer, despite having responsibility for the sector, because I'm so busy. In other words, I had very little awareness of S4C before I came into this post.
And so now, as the Minister responsible, what would be your overriding principles in terms of S4C?
My overriding priorities in my discussions with S4C are being there to assist them with any issues that might arise as they implement some of these important recommendations, as they, for instance, effect their move from Cardiff, as they engage with more independent producers. I will be engaging with them on things like the Children's Programming Contestable Fund, which I hope that they will do well out of. I'm hoping to see a more commercial focus so that they're able to raise monies to supplement the licence fee income and the income they receive from my department. I suppose those are, I would say, are the priorities for the first 12 months of my association with S4C.
And what do you, in comparison, what are your priorities then for the BBC as a whole? Brief answer on that, because this is, we're looking at as a public service broadcaster, a broadcaster for the whole of the Welsh language and the Welsh nation, but further afield internationally. So I'm just trying to get at what your priorities are with regards to that.
Well, I've given you my priorities. The BBC are obviously important, clearly, for many, many reasons, and you asked me for a brief answer, so I shan't go into all those reasons. But as far as S4C are concerned, clearly they get the vast majority of their money from the licence fee. They have to have a relationship with the BBC, and my priority here would be to make sure that S4C, as a relatively small broadcaster compared to the BBC, is in a position to punch above its weight and get the maximum support from the BBC possible.
Susan Jones, did you want to come in briefly on the back of that, and then I'm going to go to Ben Lake for the next question.
I think you've probably heard a little bit about the